Hi, everyone. Good morning from a finally sunny Washington, D.C., which is not something I could say last week or the weeks before. I wanted to say welcome to today's Thursday talk on using the everyday peace in schools methodology and how best to measure peace, and a lot more we'll be talking about. Our Thursday talks aim to bring you the best and most innovative learning there is in the peace building field and beyond. Whether this is your first Thursday talk or you're one of our regular participants, it's great to have you with us today. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Communications and Learning Officer at Search for Common Ground and the Communications Lead for DME for Peace, and I will be moderating today's session. So today, our discussion is focusing on measuring everyday peace in schools, methodology and findings, and I am delighted to welcome Dr. Terence Bevington, who is the Director of Conexus Conflict Consultancy and the Restorative Lab. Many thanks for joining us today, Terence, and for leading our discussion. Just a note about how we will all spend our time together. As Dr. Bevington is presenting, you can write your questions using the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. When you do that, also please try to write your name and affiliation if you're able, so I can attribute your questions to you. Also, this week we'll be breaking the presentation and Q&A portions down into two parts, which is a little different for us, but don't worry, I'll make it very clear as we go along. First, Terence will present his work with the Everyday Peace in Schools methodology, the findings and the process. Then we will take about 10 minutes or so where you can submit questions, and we will do a Q&A on that portion of the discussion topic. Then we'll go back in and wrap up that. Once we wrap up that discussion, we'll have another portion that's more focusing on the different perceptions of peace with Terence, who will present a bit more, and then we'll have another Q&A portion to wrap things up. But like I said, don't worry, I'll prompt you at these moments as we approach them. But I want to say, please feel free to send in your questions at any point during our discussion today. I will keep track of them, so please just send them in whenever you'd like, or as we said, raise your hand when we get to the certain Q&A portions so you can unmute yourself and ask yourself. But we'll get back to all of this when we approach those moments. So after all that, I just want to say, take it away, Terence. Thank you.
Great, Jennifer. Thanks so much for that. Welcome, everyone. Genuine joy to be here with you today from a not so sunny Spain, I have to say. I'm in Spain at the moment. I'm based in the UK most of the time, but starting to make connections in Spain. So my name's Terence Bevington. I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to introduce what we're going to do together, and then we'll quite quickly get into it. But just to say that I'm not going to be doing all the work today. In good restorative fashion, I will be asking you to do some work. So do make sure you've got a pen and a paper to hand. Okay, so my name's Terence, and I've been a teacher for 28 years, but I'm also a researcher. So I hold both of those positions in the world, as an educator, but also as a learner, as a researcher. And I very much sort of value the space of connecting those two worlds, connecting the world of practice with the world of research. Okay, so how can we build research that really helps, that's really useful? You know, I'm really motivated by both of those things, that we produce work that is useful, but also work that is robust. Yeah, so both of those things, the academic as well as the practical, motivate me. And so Everyday Peace in Schools, that was the focus of what I did. I attribute Everyday Peace Indicators was the motivation from that. I'll explain more about that shortly. And Conexus is my practitioner. That's the space through which I do the work that I do all around conflict. And Cambridge was the university where I went through my MEd first, and then my doctorate through the Faculty of Cambridge of Education there, with my supervisor, Hilary Kremin, Dr. Hilary Kremin, with whom I co-authored the book Positive Peace in Schools, which is where we make clear why and how schools can and should focus on peace. So this is part of my journey along the way of formulating what peace means and how is peace relevant to schools. You know, I work in a some would say it's not a violent, afflicted society in the UK compared to other parts of the world, but yet I am still arguing that peace is valuable. And that's really part of the motivation. The other piece of work that I've contributed is around, so restorative practice is my field. And there's a chapter I've written in here about how we can reframe and rethink restorative practice as peace practice. So as my career has evolved, I've really come to see peace as a useful frame for the work that I do with schools. So just have a look through what we're going to do. Give you an overview. By the end of it, this methodology that I'm going to take you through is so beautifully, beguilingly simple. You know, within 45 minutes, you'll be able to run it yourself. Okay, get in touch with me if you want some help to do it. Absolutely, I really welcome people getting in touch, so do get in touch. The link there, that's the first time that link has been made public, because that's where the whole thesis is now available for public access. So if people want to, you can get the whole thesis there if you feel so motivated. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And there are two parts, as Jennifer said. First of all, I'm going to walk you through the methodology, then we'll pause, have some questions, and then I'll pick it up again and share with you the conceptions of peace, the findings. What did these people in these schools say that peace meant to them? And we'll have a little question about that. Okay, so a bit of a change from normal. So first to the overview of the study. I'll give you a minute just to read through that. Okay, so you've got a grounding of what that was. It was 4 English secondary schools, 3 mainstream and 1 school with special needs students with additional needs. Okay, the study took place over about 3 years. So that's the study I'm going to take you through now. Here's the process. The first thing we need to do is we need to elicit, what do these people in these schools understand peace to be? Okay, we then need to work with that data. Let me just pause for a second. So I think before going into the methodology, probably useful for me to just clarify, why did I feel this was a useful thing to do? You know, so from my work and from my academic work, I learned that there are 2 real problems with evaluation, and evaluation of peace especially. One is congruence. So quite often, the methods that we use to measure peace are not in alignment with the principles of peace. All right, so there's not that congruence. But the other problem that we have with peace is its evaluability. So what is it that we can measure that will tell us that we have more or less peace, better peace or worse peace, more positive peace or more negative peace? So it's the congruence and the evaluability. They were the problems that I was seeking to address through this study. And what happened was, in my reading, I came across this thing called everyday peace indicators. And this beautifully simple methodology seemed to provide an answer to both of those questions. It's absolutely—
Terence, sorry to interrupt. Are we still on the first slide, or are we meant to be moving through others?
You should see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colored
No,
bars.
so we're still stuck on the first slide.
Really?
So, yeah.
Let me see what's going wrong there then, Jennifer.
Sorry about that.
No, I'm glad you said, because obviously that's not where people need to be. So let me see what you can see now.
So I can, let me
Just tell me what
try.
you see. I can't.
Right now we don't see anything. I think it's not on your screen anymore. It's just the background of our webinar.
I don't know what to do about
I
that.
can make myself presenter again and then re-share the screen with you.
On screen, yeah.
Oh, there we go. I see it now.
I don't know what happened there. That's probably me being clumsy, Jennifer. Apologies for that.
No, that's fine. I think everyone should be able to see. Oh, yep, okay. I'm getting messages saying they can see it now. Thank you. And if you want to share the link to your publication with me, you can drop it into the chat box, Terence, and I can send it out to everyone.
Okay.
Because I think they missed that slide, but they can see everything now. So we're good to go. Sorry about that.
Okay. Apologies for that. So, what motivated the study? Can we measure peace in schools with a methodology that is congruent, that is aligned with the principles of peace practice, but also making peace measurable? And this methodology suggested that yes, we could. So I thought, right, let's try it. This is the process. The first thing we need to do is we need to elicit from the people in the schools, what does peace mean to you? We're going to go through each of these steps in a bit more detail. Then we need to gather everything that they've said and sort it out, make sense of all of the things that they've said in some way, find the themes, find the underlying concepts within what they've said. What we then do is rank them. So which ones are more important and less important according to the people in this community, in this school. Then we score them and we can create a survey which gives us then evidence about the prevalence of those indicators. And then the final step in the research process was that we then engage in discussion as a community around what do those indicators mean to us. Don't worry if that's all a bit of a blur at the moment. We're going to go through each one step by step by step. So by the end, you'll be really clear about what each of those mean. So the first step, elicit. What I'm going to ask you to do is to elicit, I'm going to elicit your everyday peace indicators. So think about your everyday. What would you see, what would you hear in your everyday to indicate that you're experiencing peace? So I'm going to give you a minute and a half to scribble some things down. You might want to doodle or draw or write. You might think professionally, you might think personally. But what would we see, hear and feel in your everyday to indicate that you are experiencing peace?
And also I want to say that I have now dropped the link from Terence to his publication in the chat box. So you should find it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. So while you're finishing that off, I'll explain to you how this process ran with the school. First thing we did was I went and worked with all of the staff. Okay, so often about 100 staff in the school, teachers, cleaners, assistants, all of the staff, and got them to tell me, what are your indicators? They wrote them down on cards, separately on cards, collected them all in at the end. We then worked with an equivalent number of students. So there are 100 staff, we worked with 100 students to keep the voice balanced. And we asked them, what would be your everyday indicators of peace at this school? So it was very much a school-focused question. And the interesting thing was they didn't need any stimulus. You know, and initially I thought, I'm going to have to prep them and get them thinking, what do other people think peace means? They did not need that. There's something about this concept that they were able to just connect with and express for themselves. So hopefully you've had a chance to write some things down. We're going to come back to yours at the end. I'm going to ask you to keep hold of those. And when I show you the framework that I came up with from this study, that emerged from this study, you'll see whether your indicators fit and sit within that framework, that conceptual framework. Okay. So the first step is we've gathered all of these indicators of peace. Okay. So it may be, well, you'll see what some of them are in a second. We've gathered them, and I've then sorted them all. So I did this job as the researcher, so collating and sorting them down into 20 or 30. We need to get that whole body of indicators down to a useful, usable number, because we're going to start working with this data that you've given us. And down to 20 or 30. So obviously we're looking at which ones are most common, but we're also sometimes going to look at what are some of the outliers. So there might be something in there that's just really interesting, you know? So one was that, that pupils stop fights between other pupils. It wasn't typical, not many people said it, but it just felt really useful and interesting. So sometimes you'll include an outlier because it's provocative. Another one was school dinners, the quality of school dinners as an indicator of everyday peace. Felt a bit random to me, but we included it, okay? So using that sample to be, yes, representative, but also provocative, okay? So you reduce them down to those indicators. And then what we're going to do is we're going to rank them. So this is using something which some of you will be familiar with called Q methodology, and it's a forced ranking. So with those 20 or 30 indicators, people had to rank them in terms of least important and most important as indicators of peace in their school. So this is not whether they are more true or less true, more prevalent or less prevalent, but are they more important or less important as indicators? So with Q methodology, you don't need a big sample. So we had about 20 people, 10 students and 10 staff who completed this exercise. And what that then enables us to do is to create a ranking. Okay, by simply, if it's most important, it scores +2. If it's least important, it scores -2. So wherever you laid your indicators, we can then just create a really simple scoring and ranking of your school's indicators, which we can then use. So you can see what we're doing is we're converting qualitative data into quantitative data. This is where you start making peace measurable, because you've got the qualitative statements which we're converting into quantitative measures. So for example, this was from one school. This was the top 14 in order, the ranking. So that was the ranking for the collective ranking of students and staff. What you can do, and what we did do, is you can separate them out and you can compare how did the ranking of the staff compare with the ranking of the students? Where were the discrepancies? Where are the points of interest there? Yeah, so you've got a collective conception of peace, which the most important factor being that we are all valued equally. We'll come back to these, the quality of these indicators later in the second half. But for now, it's the methodology that we're interested in. So what we can then do with this, which is what we did do, is you create a survey. Very simple survey. So please, on a sliding scale from 0 to 10, how true is this of your school? We are all valued equally. 0, absolutely not true. 10, absolutely true. Okay, so you can see, just use a simple Likert scale for us to assess for prevalence of the most important indicators in our school. You can then start to imagine how you can use that data. Yeah, you can do it as a starting point. If we're about to embark on a piece of piecework, a starting point is where are we now? And then we can use it as a post-test. We'll explore a little bit in a moment about the different applications, but one of them is that, a very simple way of measuring peace in our school. And the final, pardon me, the final stage was the discussion. So this was the focus groups and interviews, and these were the questions we discussed. So obviously they had sight of, you know, the top indicators in their school, and that was the stimulus for the discussion. And this is where this was the really transformative element of the process, if I'm honest with you. It was the dialogue that happened here. It was really deep, really connected with some deep questions around philosophy of education, about why do we do what we do in this school? What are our priorities? Are our priorities right in this school? Also really wide, as you'll go on to see in the second half. you know, the different topics that came up for question. So that was essentially the process. We got to the end point there. I provided the school with a report of what had come up and what the people in the school had said about what had come up. One of the schools used it to as a focus, as a frame for their work around well-being. Another school used it as the work that they were doing on their school values. So you can see how it would fit within both of those focuses. So we got to the end. So you've got those simple stages. Gather all of the indicators, sort them out and reduce them. Get people to rank them in terms of importance, score that, create a ranking, create the survey, you can measure them, talk about them, you can act on them. It's as simple as that. It really is. So there are obviously complexities in there, but there you have to go to the thesis to read the complexities about it. So just to look at what they said. So how was the process for them? They valued the participatory. This is the congruence with peace values. It was participatory. They enjoyed doing the ranking, having to think about stuff. There was no right or wrong answer. Okay. It was transformative in how they thought about their school. They'd never thought about their school within the frame of peace before, and it made them think differently. It disrupted some of their thinking. And the values, how it made concrete in their everyday indicators, it was making concrete the values that they held as a community. So that was what they said about the process. And then finally, before we move into some questions, I'll ask you to start thinking about some questions you might have on this part. How might we use this methodology? So actually as an intervention in and of itself, by doing this process of inquiry, you know, peace was being built in terms of the conversations that were happening. You can use it as an evaluation tool to capture where are we now, where are we later? And then even more, what's the word, aspirationally, potentially, look at how can we think about how our school could be better through the lens of peace. Okay, so I'm going to pause there while we have some questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. So at this point in time, it'll be like any of our other Q&A portions where you can send them in using the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, or you can raise your hand using the little hand icon also on the dashboard, and I'll unmute you so you can ask yourself. We actually have a few questions that have come in already, so I will pose those while others are writing their questions in or raising their hands. So our first question here is from Rachel Goldwyn. Rachel is a conflict and sensitivity and peace building advisor for WFP. The question is whether Terence or indeed others on this webinar have any insights on whether there is evidence that links school attendance to reduce child recruitment into armed groups. In particular, I am interested to know about the methodologies used by different agencies that might be trying to examine any links.
Okay, I mean that is not part of my world, I have to say. You know, that sort of context is not my context, so I wouldn't be, you know, the strongest person to answer that question. One of the things that I can maybe on a aligned sort of point say is that the original Everyday Peace Indicators methodology was developed for more conflict-ridden contexts. You know, so that, but it was working at a community level. And one of the things that we're looking at exploring is how can this methodology be used in that context? So
Yeah,
beyond that,
no.
Rachel.
Sorry, Terence, I was going to say, recognizing that that is not your area of focus, I will say that we are very open for anyone who wants to raise their hand and share their own experiences or insight on that matter, or if they want to like send in instead of a question and answer to that question that links school attendance to recruitment into armed groups and methodologies that are used that or have been used trying to examine this. If you want to send in those thoughts, or if you want to raise your hand and talk at any point during this Q&A to address that, please feel free. Otherwise, we're going to move on. But thank you, Rachel, for that. That's a great question. We have some that have come in saying, one from Melinda Holmes asks, could you elaborate on the use of the personal relationship, relationship, institutional categories in the process?
So that's exactly what we're going to do after this. So in the second half, Melinda, that's exactly what we're going to focus on. So if you're able to hold on to that question, then that's exactly what we're going to look at next.
That works for us. We have a question from Sami Dick asking, what practical challenges did you encounter deploying this method? How did you mitigate these?
Yeah, great question, Zoe. Thanks. It was, that thing about first of all, is how do you get into schools? How do you get schools to be open to expending energy and time? Time is a resource they don't have much of. How do you convince them that there's a value in this? And fortunately, what I came across were some head teachers who were really committed to the idea of peace. That one of them was just intrigued. He'd never thought about peace before. So the first thing is about how you get people on board. Then in terms of the practical challenges, I'd say one of them is the different skill sets that you need as a researcher or as the facilitator. So as you can imagine, there was a process there which is about group facilitation. There's a process there which is about data analysis, quantitative as well as qualitative. And there's a process there which is about interviewing. So it did sort of stretch me. Thankfully, I'm a bit older. I've got quite a few years behind me in terms of research experience. But it did draw on and call on a lot of the skill sets that I have as a researcher. So I suppose that was one of the practical challenges.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a question from Asmeet Kaur. So, my apologies for any mispronunciation. Asmeet asks, if we were to measure discrepancies between theory and practice when we look at institutionalization of peace in schools, how effective would be ethnography as a method? It offers visual measure of observation.
So ethnography, again,
yes.
is not my choice of method. I have looked at ethnography. It's not the choice of method that I have. In terms of the gap between, was it theory and
practice? Yeah.
So in terms of theory and practice, one of the major intentions of the work was to see how did the theory stand up next to the practice. So once we've got this empirical evidence, these empirically derived conceptions of what does peace mean, how do they relate to, how do they either confirm or extend or challenge peace theory? And one of the things that I'll say, I'm going to move on to it next, but one of the things was it provided empirical support for more recent peace theory. So especially in thinking around peace as related to questions of difference. All right, that was quite surprising. I wasn't anticipating that, but it really did. What people said, if you recall back, we're all valued equally. This question of difference, diversity, how we treat the other was the most important indicator across all 4 schools. So that peace is essentially around questions of diversity and difference. So the relation to the theory was that actually the most recent post-structural peace theory, yes. More critical peace theory, yes. It does support that. So that's the relationship that was drawn out from this, Asmeet. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and Ashmeet also, asked if you have any studies that you can suggest that deal with the institutionalization of peace education in schools. That would be helpful. But that's something that perhaps you can share with us and we can put on the page with the recording when we post it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Absolutely, but
some further reading.
I can point people straight away to the Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group. So the Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group. If you Google that, you'll come across the website. And, some of the members there, so my supervisor, but also Kevin Kester, who's a peace educator, he's written a lot around critical peace education. So that is about not having, a peace education that doesn't disrupt. Actually, peace education needs to disrupt because of the structural and cultural violence. So,
Great.
yeah.
Thank you. Keeping in mind our time, we do have 3 questions left that that I will ask. So I'm just letting you know, Terence, there's 3 questions. So keep that in mind with our time. But let's just get on with them. Elena Slavova asks, how long does this process take? Are FGDs conducted in randomly mixed groups or split by some variable?
What was the second question? Are what?
I think FGDs conducted in randomly mixed groups or split by some sort of variable.
FTDs.
FGDs? Focus
FGDs.
group discussions.
A focus group discussion there, right? Okay. So how long? Okay, so each school was sequentially. So from start to finish in the school was, I would say, a term. So about 3 months from start to finish. So to answer that question sort of succinctly. And then in terms of randomization and all of that, is sort of originally, yes, that was the intention. What happened is when it hit the ground, the schools wanted to take more ownership of how things ran. And you can imagine there were pros and cons to that. They made it more their own process, which was in keeping with peace philosophy. It's theirs. So who am I as a researcher to say I know better than you? So there was this negotiation there, which meant that there was some loss there in terms of having, the randomness. So what we sought instead was representativeness. So within the focus groups, we wanted a range, so representative groups from the students as well as from the staff. Hopefully that answers those questions. Shall I move on to the last section?
Sure,
Jennifer?
move on, and I will save the 2 questions that I have right now for that portion. Great.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So they're the uses. What I'm going to share with you now is what came out. All right, so it was with 4 schools. Each school generated its own conception of peace. But also there were then, what we did was collated across the schools as well. Okay, so what would I say? The synthesized definition of what does peace mean across these 4 schools is this. So hopefully you can see that there's a lot in there, I'm going to unpack that with you now. But this thing in the center, it's essentially around questions of difference. I've already referred to that. So Hartmut Beer, who people may be familiar with, is a peace scholar, and B-E-H-R, and his work is a post-structural peace theory that, as I mentioned earlier, it's all about our relationship with the other. Who is the other? How do I feel and think and behave towards the other? How does the other behave towards me? So all of those questions of difference come up in terms of what peace means. And this is the framework. So this is what Melinda was asking about. So for those of you who've seen it, it's the 3 levels: the personal peace, relational peace, institutional peace. I'm just going to talk through them and then we'll come back to any questions around that. So hopefully, Melinda, by the end of this short presentation, 5 minutes now, you'll be really clear about what this diagram represents. So this is an analytical framework that emerged from the 1,100 indicators that came from the 4 schools. Okay, and using different frameworks, this is the framework that I ended up with that seemed most satisfying, seemed most true to the data. And when we look at personal peace, there were 3 dimensions of personal peace. So the notion of feelings, how people feeling safe, people feeling secure, people feeling valued, people feeling respected. So the naming of these feelings that people associate with peace was one dimension. And also how they express them. So people smiling, okay, people greeting one another. So how people express their feelings. The second dimension of personal peace, for me, is the most potent contribution that the study makes to knowledge. You know, this notion that I've just referred to about how peace relates to my sense of who is the other and who am I to the other. So how free am I to be the person that I am in all of my integrity? How free am I? How free are you? And how free are we in our difference to be in community? So this whole notion of freedom became really core. As I've said, in all 4 schools, an indicator relating to people are valued for who they are, people are free to be themselves without judgment. Indicators around this dimension of freedom were at the top in all 4 schools. And the third dimension of personal peace is around the function. So the function of the school. So as a student, as a learner, how connected am I with my role as a learner in this institution? As a teacher, as an educator, how connected am I with my role as an educator on a personal level? What is my personal connection with my role? Hopefully that's clear. The middle level of relational peace. Okay, it's not surprising that we have relational peace there, although it's quite interesting. You don't really read much about relational peace. It's not really a concept that's discussed much, but it's sort of intuitively, it seems like a right focus. And it came out in the study quite strongly, you know, actually most strongly. Out of the 3 levels, it was relational peace that most of the indicators fell into. And when people talked about relationships, this is where they talked around, you know, what relationships do they have? What is the quality of those relationships? What's the quality of the connection that we have? Do I have someone to turn to? And within relationships, people also talked about conflict. So if we think about conflict as a social phenomenon, as a relational phenomenon, that's where the discussion around conflict came out. And really, what was the word I'd use? Reassuringly, people didn't see absence of conflict as an indicator of peace very much. People accepted that conflict's going to happen, especially in a school. If you work or live in a school, you know that conflict is going to happen. All right, so it's not about having no conflict. There wasn't that idea. It was very much about how do we respond to conflict. That was what was the indicator of peace. Do we have dialogue? Do we enable people to reflect? Do we help people to learn? All right, so they were the indicators of peace. How do we deal with conflict within our relationships in our school? In terms of the routine social behaviors, a lot of that was just the everydayness, people holding the door open for one another, people lending people things, people walk through the corridors respectful of who else is around. And also here, communication. So how do people routinely communicate in our school? How do people communicate when they have a difference with somebody else? Those questions of communication sat there. And then at the institutional level, the 3 dimensions of environment, curriculum, and systems. To be honest, environment didn't appear massively. It wasn't so strong. So that static thing about spaces in the school, that wasn't a strong indicator. Curriculum was fairly strong, but not so important. So it appeared a lot, but people didn't really think it was important. So for example, people talked about mindfulness and meditation and whether those aspects of a curriculum life would indicate peace. And people said, yes, it may do, but it's not appropriate to school. They didn't feel that it fitted within the school context, which on a personal level, as a meditator, I was disappointed by, but the evidence is the evidence. And then the final level is systems. So the school systems, and specifically those school systems around behavior. So how do we promote pro-social behavior? How do we respond to antisocial behavior in our school? How we do that will tell us whether we are more or less peaceful school. So what you can do now is have a think. You'll go back to your everyday peace indicators from the very beginning. So what did you write down? And just have a think. Where might that fit? Does it fit? Where might that fit within this conceptual model for conceptions of peace? So Jennifer, I'm that's there.
Lovely. Yes. While all of you are thinking, or if you're coming up with your additional questions and sending it in, now is the time to do that. I also want to say that we have dropped the Cambridge Peace and Education Resource Group that Terence recommended, the link to the website in the chat box, and also their Twitter handle. So that's great. Thank you, Roy Lighton, for that, actually. And we will kick off with Roy's question, which is, what was, in school, there's usually a cohort of teachers who are reluctant to engage in questionnaires. What was the level of engagement with the most reluctant of teachers and pupils using this approach?
Yeah, great question, Roy. Good to have you here. And so they were self-selecting. All right. So self-selecting, originally, it was all of the staff, and it was in a staff session, so they didn't have a choice about whether they were there or not. They had a choice about whether they gave me their indicators. So I said to people, you know, ethically, if you don't want to take part in the study, you take it home with you. You don't need to submit it to me. But then when we got to the level of who does the ranking and who does the focus groups, it was self-selecting, and that was sort of ethical reasons for that. I know that it sort of reduces the robustness, and some might say, but the ethical reasons around, you know, if people are busy, then they need to be volunteering to take part in this study. Okay, so that was one of the factors that was important. So recognizing that because it's a self-selecting group, that it's not necessarily representative. Okay, so that I think we just acknowledge that is the way it is. In the same way that the schools were self-selecting, I did approach some schools who I hoped they would take part because I wanted to disrupt. Knowing those schools very well, I sensed that there wasn't so much peace, and so I quite wanted to disrupt that, but they wouldn't let me in. So yeah, that's just the way it worked out.
We have a question from Hope, which is a bit linked to school's interests. Hope asked, would you be willing and available to share your experience with some schools who are interested to learn on the everyday indicators, or for schools interested in revamping their curriculum for peace education? Like, which did you find that? Because Hope was asked by a local NGO recently who was running a school about something related to this. So how were you approached, I believe is more of the question. Were the schools interested in that sort of revamping, or, yeah?
So no, I approached schools. So some were schools that I knew, some were schools that I didn't know. So I sent out invitations, sort of just open invitation for schools to submit an interest. As I said earlier, one was a head teacher who was just intrigued. You know, he'd done a lot of work. He was a very experienced head teacher and had never thought about peace in the school context. He'd always thought about peace as a global question, never as a sort of local question. So for him, it provoked some interest in him. Other schools so there were some schools that I'd already worked with for a while on restorative practice, you know, so how that fits and sits within a peace framing. So they were already interested. But Hope, if you want to, do get in touch with me. You know, if you want to, I'm really happy to have a conversation about, you know, resource ways we might respond to schools that are expressing an interest in that.
Sure. We have 3 more questions, and just making note of the time, I will pose these and then we'll probably need to wrap it up. So we have a question from Ava Amor, or Armor, apologies. What was the consensus building process for arriving at indicators?
So the consensus building process for arriving at indicators. So they created, I listed from them hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of indicators. In terms of reducing those down, Eva, I wonder if this is where the question is. So reducing those down, and I got in touch with the original developers of the methodology and asked them what guidance they use to identify which are the indicators that you should reduce them to. They said, we're still learning. It's an imperfect science. And so what I did was I then engaged a sort of very methodical process of how was I grouping and reducing them down. So things like taking photos every stage of it, audio recording my thought process. So the consensus was really my consensus, if that's not a contradiction ever. So they generated hundreds of individual indicators. I then grouped them. So the group came from me. You could do that grouping with the participants. I decided to do it myself in terms of not putting too much expectation on the school to do the work for the research project. If you were doing this as an in-house process of peace education in your school, absolutely, you would do that process yourselves. And if you go to the Everyday Peace Indicators website, there's guidance there about how they do that in community, because they do that with the community. All right, so go to the Everyday Peace Indicators website, Ava, and have a look at how they describe that. That might be helpful.
Thanks so much. Ajmi had a final question about were students able to assess how well or poorly they comprehended their own emotions, relationships, etc., or did they find this to be a challenge?
Okay, it's a great question. And yeah, there were secondary school students, and I chose secondary over primary because I anticipated that it would require some maturity, which I think the question's alluding to. I also worked with the school, the special school, and it was in that school that some of the conceptual, the abstractness of it did start to get a little bit problematic. We had to make a lot of amendments to the process in that context. In terms of generally with the mainstream students, I think what I would argue is it was through the dialogue. So a lot of them, whilst they could have done, so if you remember the ranking, where the forced ranking on the Q grid, the Q methodology, whilst it was anticipated that they would do that individually, a lot of them chose to do that in 2s or 3s. And it was the conversations that they had with their partners, you know, I think that then helped them with some of the things that you're talking about there in that question.
Great, and for our final question, also has a bit to do with difficulties raised. Graham Carrington asks, did you find that the approach helped raise difficult issues? If so, how did you or would you manage any associated risks?
Yeah, another great question. Absolutely, it did. It really did raise sensitive issues. So one of the schools talked about how, so there'd been there was a conflict around certain students' right to express their freedom to express their ideas, which were quite homophobic, and other students' freedom to be free from oppression. So it got right into some of the sensitivities, you know, that sit at the heart of it all. And so how to mitigate, oops, I do apologize. That's not even my phone. Is that somebody else's phone?
No, I believe it's just you and I, so I don't know where it's coming from. My apologies. Somewhere in the interwebs, we have picked up a phone.
I do apologize. I have my phone switched off, but it came through my computer. Are you still there, Jennifer?
Yes, we're still here. If you want to touch on the how to mitigate before we wrap up.
Sorry about that. That was my foster son inconveniently calling me at that time. Sorry about that. Great. So yeah, how to mitigate that. It was very much about the link person, the lead person in the school taking the lead. So that person held the process for me. Yeah, so working within the systems and them knowing their students because they didn't know me. So it was having that safeguard about working closely with the lead person in the schools. apologize for that disruption there, Jennifer, and everybody else.
Oh, no problem at all. It happens to all of us, I think, after this past year, especially. We all have stories to tell. So I wanted to say a special thank you to our host, Dr. Terence Bevington, for your wonderful presentation and also the interactive elements, which is a nice mix-up for us. And thank you to everyone who could join us today and who submitted their questions and shared their thoughts. This recording and additional helpful website links will be posted on the webinar recording on the DME for Peace site by the end of this week, and you can find that under the M&E Thursday Talk section on the website. So you can go back there and you have the opportunity to return to it or share it with your colleagues. Also, please feel free to continue the discussion online in the comments section, and as Terence has already said a couple of times, he is very happy for you to reach out to him directly, which the information you found on the first slide, and you'll be able to go back to that information as well when we post the recording up on the website. So that's it for us today. Thank you for sticking around with us, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with Games for Peace, talking about all things surrounding gamifying peace and the peace process, and also using new technologies in our work. It should be very timely and quite interesting for all involved. I know I'm looking forward to it because I have a lot to learn in that area personally. So we look forward to discussing this with you in March. And well, that's it from me. Keep an eye out on our website and social media platforms for exact details on our upcoming M&E Thursday talks. I hope that you all have a great rest of your day. And thanks again, Terence, for that.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. All right, bye, everyone.
Bye.